Hello and welcome to Journeys and Journals. I'm Bernie Martin Beck and I get to meet people from all over who've come to the Rogue Valley, Southern Oregon, Northern California to call it home. Pack your bags, folks. We're going to be traveling today with, who are you?
Virginia Smith.
Virginia, with a name like Smith, you could be from any place.
That's true.
But what brings you out west?
My parents.
Your parents. Mm-hmm. And there she is. There's Mom.
Mm-hmm. And they were getting older, and I was the person in the family who could move without disrupting too much, and so I was the lucky one that got to move home to
and she wept buckets of tears over leaving the congested East Coast.
Oh.
No, that's a joke.
Near enough to April 1. No, we were so happy to have her.
Yeah. So now, you came to a country that your husband is from. Is that right?
Well, that's true. He is from Southern Oregon, but I also, some of my very earliest memories are of crossing the Siskiyous in the snow and coming to Medford to have Thanksgiving or Christmas with my grandparents who lived in Medford, Dad's parents.
Now they also lived where?
They lived in Hood River. They were from the Portland area originally and then went to Hood River. Grandpa managed fruit orchards there.
Well, what took them to Medford?
A school that they wanted their boys to attend.
And was he an orchard person there?
Yes.
Yes, so he managed orchards and then he bought orchards, and when he finally retired and sold them, they were bought by Harry and David. So that gives me a very special feel for this part of the country to know.
And may I just add that he was not anxious for his boys to go to school. He thought they could be farmers like he was and orchard men, and they said yes, they could. But as they decided, changed their minds, went to school, became doctors, he said, well, they're just taking after me. They're surgeons. I'm a tree surgeon.
And later, when my grandparents had moved back to Portland again to be close to their other son, I remember going out with Grandpa into his backyard, and he had 4 or 5 different kinds of apples growing on the same tree.
Oh, and such pride in grafting.
Yes.
Yeah.
Such beautiful flower gardens.
Yeah, they were wonderful gardeners, farmers.
Now the pears are special to Southern Oregon, and we are, Harry and David's are known around the world.
That's right.
That's right.
But they're really your trees.
Well, I think it's Harry and David's Bear Creek Orchard that was Grandpa Schuler's orchard.
Okay,
That's what I understand.
So the Schulers.
Well, he managed the Oregon orchard for a good many years, and then he had a little orchard of his own, which is now under a golf course.
No, their house, their retirement home in Medford is under the golf course.
Yes.
No, their orchard is Harry and David's Bear Creek Orchard,
Okay.
is what I understand.
Oh, and their names?
Schuler, Frank and Emma Schuler.
Okay, and that's your
That's
husband's?
My father's parents.
Aha.
Yes.
So you visited that as a
Yes.
child, and you went there often?
Well, we even went there when my husband went overseas. I went there with the 2 little girls and lived there part-time in Oregon with my folks.
Now, your husband was overseas, why?
22 months.
The U.S. government called him?
Yes.
Out of medical school to go in. What did he do while he was in the Army?
Well, he started out doing KP, kitchen patrol, and then gas warfare, and whatever needed to be done. He came home one night just laughing his head off. He went to bed laughing. He couldn't get over it. They'd had a practice battle, and they threw flour bombs, flour like you bake with, at each other, and they finally even got one thing on fire, and the whole fire department came out, and they just had a wallop all day. They just had such a good time. Well, that was before he got taken overseas, but
So we're talking World War II, and they were practicing how to get out of the way of
how to do chemical warfare. They had fake chemicals.
which is in a flour bag from. Okay, but you have a story about flour? Different continent, different
Yes.
world, a different hemisphere even.
Yes.
What's the story?
About 2.5, 3 years after my husband and I got married, we moved to East Africa.
Okay, long.
We had
That's called a geographic.
Yes. We had a baby girl, 3 weeks old, the day we left Portland.
Ouch.
And we stopped over in Oklahoma to visit mom and dad. And so she turned 5 weeks old the day we arrived in East Africa. So that was culture shock. But we were there for 10 years altogether, and every slice of bread that we ate the whole 10 years I had to bake.
Okay.
That was culture shock.
So what's the story about this?
There was not a good supply of flour. There was no whole wheat flour to buy. There was white flour. There was something called atta that was a mixture of whole wheat and white and cornmeal. Did not make good bread. And so we could buy wheat kernels, and I knew people who would buy the wheat kernels, and then they would go through it kernel by kernel and get out all the dirty stuff, and then they'd wash it and put it in the oven to dry, and then they would take it down to a local grinder and have it ground into flour.
Okay.
But that was an awful lot of work. And if you
had a new
really want
baby.
something done efficiently, you look for a very lazy person and see how they're doing it. I had a baby. I had no electricity. I had a wood stove to bake in.
Aha.
Right
And
back
you're
to basics.
Lazy, I don't think, but what did you do?
I figured out that I could soak the wheat overnight. When I put the water on it, a lot of the filth would come to the top and I could pour it off. And then soak it overnight, and it would be all nice and plumped up and big the next morning, and it was easy to rinse off anything else that needed to be rinsed off. And then I would put the kernels in a grinder just like this and grind them through, and it was cracked wheat then. But it developed the gluten because it was so wet, and it would be kind of stringy when I finished with that. And I would add a little soy flour. It was easier to clean soybeans and take them down, have them made into flour. I would add a little bit of that and then make the bread with white flour. Made very, very delicious cracked wheat bread. We still remember that, but I've never found time to make it in the States.
I'll let you take this home and you bring me a loaf
Actually,
of bread.
I have one of those.
Oh.
So if I ever get around to making bread again that way, I will definitely remember you, Bernie.
Oh. Now, we've got this picture here, and before I wanted just to remember who these folk are.
Well, these are mom and dad, just a couple years before dad died, and all of their 8 children in chronological order, beginning on this side. My older sister.
You want to
and
name them?
Joanne Vipond, and then me, Virginia Smith, and then my brother, Randy Schuler, who is an orthodontist up in Sunnyside, Washington, and Bill Schuler, who is a retired surgeon around Denver, and then David Schuler, the musician and
The one
salesman.
that never finished college?
The only one who didn't graduate. He lives down in the Napa area. My sister, Judy Balkins, who raises horses in Boise.
And now the twins,
And then
right?
the twins, yes. And Daryl is a dentist in Denver area, and Dennis is a truck driver in the Denver area.
And that picture refutes the theory that the last ones are made out of scraps, because you can see the youngest one is the largest one of all.
Dennis is the tallest.
Oh my goodness. Well, thank you for introducing me to the. Now, you've talked about your home. Your mother talked about her place out on the prairie before.
Mm-hmm.
What was Africa? What was your spacious, gracious, out of Africa home like?
Oh, well, when we got there, I was amazed because I had no idea what to expect. I thought we might be living in a thatched roof hut.
With mud walls?
I thought that might be the case. We were living in quite a big house. It had a tin roof, and the rats knew better than I did that the walls were mud walls. They worked their way through, but it was painted over. It didn't look that bad. But no electricity, and eventually we got a little gas stove, but gas was very expensive, so we would kind of save the gas stove for special occasions. But mostly we had a big wood stove, and there were big irons, you know, that like you iron clothes with, that came with the stove. And so we had to heat those up. And
flat irons.
Flat irons. Flat irons were there.
Now, by this time, you'd grown up in a fine home with all the light switches and everything. Not
Pretty
like,
much.
Not like Mom with the house out back.
No, not at all. We visited one family of relatives who had that, so I had experienced that once, but.
What were you expecting? Why did you go to Africa? I mean, what's motivation?
As I was growing up, I thought about Africa because Mother's older sister was a missionary there for 20-some years altogether before she moved back to the States. So we would get letters from her, and I would go to Bible class on the weekend, and they would tell us mission stories, and they'd tell a story about Africa and say, now how many of you want to grow up and go to Africa? And I always waved my hand. Sometimes it was China, sometimes it was India, but many times it was Africa. And then I spent one of my college years in Mexico.
Oh, as a
I went down for summer school and ended up spending a whole year at Matamoros in northern Mexico and loved it. It was just wonderful.
Well, now, Mom just loved lots of things about college, but now this is a kind of a chip off the old block here.
In a way, yes. Mother always talked about how fun college was. And when I got there, I discovered there was some hard work involved. She never mentioned that. but I started college when I was only 16, so I had some time to spare. So I ended up actually in college for 5 years before I graduated, and the middle year was in Mexico. And it was great. And after that experience, I knew that I really would like to be an expat someplace, you know, an expatriate.
Oh, okay.
An American living overseas somewhere.
That's what you call them.
Yes.
My mom was born in Chile of mission parents.
Oh.
And so she always had that country close to her heart. Were any of your children born in Africa?
Yes. It was my daughter Jennifer, who was just 5 weeks old when we got there. And then our son Darcy was born in Tanzania a year and a half later. And he had a Tanzanian passport as well as an American, or actually a Tanzanian birth certificate as well as an American birth certificate. And at that point in time, he was allowed to wait until he was 18 or 21 before deciding which country he wanted to actually claim. But then they changed the law eventually, and he no longer had that right. So then we had to get a passport for him.
So he's not a Tanzanian.
He's not a Tanzanian.
Now you have the 2 children?
We have the 2 children, and we have another son who adopted us, a very dear person to us, Bernie Stepke, and he and his wife just had a baby boy just a couple weeks ago.
Oh, Grandma.
So we have a grandson. Our daughter has 2 girls, so we have 2 granddaughters.
Well, now, your mom was telling us about her work with little dolls, making dolls out of almost nothing. This is something that she passed on to you, love of children. You made things for 3 Angels Broadcasting and for their gift shop.
Oh, I try to. I'd love to make more, but I don't get enough done.
Well, I'm hoping that she will make something for Bernie out of this doll that's this big.
I'll remind her. She'll do it. She'll put it on the list. She'll get it done.
One of my dear precious friends here in town grew up in India, and she said there things were sparse, and their dolls were really just a little leg with a little shoe, and they could take that doll around, and it would just, I mean, it was to them the whole doll.
That just proves that very young children are abstract thinkers.
Right, and you said that doll that you make is just kind of fabric and a little tied up. I've got to see that. Yeah. Now, did you teach while you were there in Africa? I mean, were your your responsibilities were what? Raise your own 2 children?
I had one baby when I got there and another one soon after, so that took up a lot of my time. But when the English teacher from a boarding school had to leave because of needing surgery, I ended up teaching English to high school seniors in Tanzania, preparing them for their government exams. That was a good experience. And then a few years went by and my children were old enough to go to school, and I realized it was either me or illiteracy, because if I had put them in a local school, they would have taken the place of an African child, because there was not enough space in the schools for all of the children. So I got to teach my own children, and it was the most fun thing I did in the 10 years I lived there. I loved it.
Now, did you teach them to talk with a Southern accent too?
You don't
What
know
was their
how
accent?
hard I have tried to get rid of this Southern accent.
Where'd
but
you get it?
People tell me. We moved to Madison, Tennessee when I was 5, and we lived there until I was 15.
This is because
Dad was a surgeon there at that hospital.
But I don't recognize that she has any different accent. Do I also?
No, you're Canuck through and through. You just sound like a gal right off the prairie. I haven't heard you say about yet, or out. Do you say Canadian
No.
things?
I think she left that behind since her parents were actually American, not Canadian. Although she had relatives who were Canadian, but she didn't quite take on all the nuances of Canadian English.
And your father was a trained man, college man.
At that time, no. For some reason, several in the family, both Canadian and American, decided to get, well, I think that they even heard that there was oil or something, and they got what?
Homesteads.
Free
Homesteads
land.
in
Yes.
Canada, yes.
Tell us
And
that.
it was very rugged living for 7 years.
What about?
They bought it in a good year. 7 years later, they
Well,
sold
they-
it in a good year.
They went up and claimed it in a good year.
Yes.
Well, now, what's the story about this runaway horse?
Well, I think that's my first memory, is being in a cart with the horse just running away and everybody trying to hold it. And I remember rocks and water. That's all. I was under 3.
Under 3 and a runaway horse. Wow. What's your earliest memory?
I have some very, very vague memories of Portland while Dad was overseas. But one of my very vivid early memories was coming to Portland at Christmas time. And we came through the snow across the Siskiyous. And I remember that I got 5 dolls that Christmas. And so I had all my 5 dolls lined up, and I was having a wonderful time playing with them. And somebody discovered that I had practically lost my voice, and they just instantly made me go to bed and started treating my bad cold or whatever it was that was coming on. So that's a very early memory.
5 dolls. You had
That was a good Christmas.
That was good. Yeah. Oh, I remember when I was sick. I had a car wreck, fell out of the car, and I got one. They called it real skin. It was a soft rubber that they had right after the war. And oh my, I was so thrilled to have a doll with real skin. I don't know how they made them so nice, but it was fun to have a dolly.
They did used to be beautiful.
Yeah.
I guess they are now. I don't buy them now, but
You don't
still
play with many
beautiful.
dolls. I wanted to ask you questions about children, and I can't imagine what it was like to try to cook without all the finery that you have now, the machines, the Bosch, the whatever. How did you do this in Africa?
I usually had a servant to clean the house and do the laundry. I wasn't real comfortable with that, but I just couldn't keep up with everything that needed to be done.
2 little babies.
2 little babies. And so I did the cooking. And I just didn't do a whole lot else. Just took all the time there was just to survive. And so that made me realize what pioneer women lived like, and made me really admire them for making beautiful quilts and other things that they did under those circumstances.
And dolls out of
Yes.
scraps of material, and
That's right.
aprons out of Dad's shirts,
And the flour sacks.
the flour sacks.
Oh, yes, we used to collect those. When
Education has been a primary importance to your family,
It has been.
and it isn't stopped now. You're of retirement age, right?
Almost.
You're not retiring.
I'm 64. Well, you know, I'm still as healthy as I was when I was 20, I would say at this point. So I'm still very much enjoying life. And Mother at 94 is still enjoying life. So I hope I have a ways to go yet.
And I'm kind of in between. I'm just soon to be 70, and I think, well, a year and a few months, and I'll be, I can't think of a time
well,
that's
you have 30 years yet to go. Good.
can't think of a time that things have been better.
That's wonderful.
I'm so grateful that cancer only knocked me down for a short time, and I popped right back up, ready
That's
on
wonderful.
a run.
Wonderful.
And I needed a good doctor, but I have one too.
Good.
So
Good.
your dad's gone now?
Yes, he
and-
died just a month before his 92nd birthday.
But did he like living on the coast?
Oh, he loved it.
Yes, he liked it.
What do you do over there? Keep yourself out of mischief.
Oh, I don't have any trouble because I can't get into mischief anymore. I am just trying to wear down the stash of yarn I've collected through the years when I wanted to knit and couldn't.
Mother has 5 things that she really enjoys doing.
Number one.
Knitting is, 10, 12, 14 hours a day. But she also enjoys traveling
Oh,
and reading
okay.
and eating
Oh, that too.
and shopping. And not necessarily in that order.
Okay, now tell me about this shopping. What are you going to do tomorrow?
Shop. I have 2 little gifts I need to get, just so I'll go specially for them. I just don't go hog wild. But after all, well, that would just be so nice for that person, or that's just what they need. And
I hear you're going to the big city.
yes, for Joanne, the oldest daughter's grandbaby's first birthday, and the second daughter of one of the twins for baptism in the same week.
And they're going to Medford. And Medford used to really be the big city. I mean, they had an elevator in Mann's department store, and that was half the fun of going to Medford, was that you got to ride the elevator.
And now it's such a big city. I used to walk from the farm downtown when I was there, and it didn't seem very far at all, but I think it'd be a long ways now.
Several miles.
Well, where was the farm? Do you-
Oregon Orchard,
Okay.
wherever that
And
was.
was it in Phoenix? Maybe in
Wherever
Phoenix.
it was.
What? You bring so many memories. What was Phoenix like in those days? Was there a town
Phoenix
there?
next to Medford? Well, I only knew of it as farm area where his folks lived out on that farm.
Okay. Now, your earliest memories of coming into Medford was snowy.
Yes.
Well, they were
because
by
we
then in
would-
another house,
that-
weren't they?
My folks were living in Southern California by this time. Dad had come back from overseas and was doing further study in Southern California, and so we would come up for the holidays to visit the grandparents.
I can almost guess that everybody that's done Siskiyous has one snow story to tell.
Well, I have a memory of hunting Easter eggs in the snow. And Mother's
That
not
was
sure she remembers that.
Oh, yes, that was
Yes.
Kings Valley down in California.
Okay.
Oh,
All right.
well,
We drove
we-
up there from Bakersfield, up there, and it was Easter, so the children took their eggs and their baskets, and we went up there, and they had a
And they
Easter
were
egg
and they were
hunt.
colored eggs, so we managed to find them in the snow.
Oh, good. Thank goodness. Because Easter was oftentimes a rainy day here in Southern Oregon. And I can remember sunrise service moved into the high school auditorium because it was a pouring down rain. And we always had company over, lots of kids over, because that was just a wonderful time to get together.
Yes.
we never re-hunted them. Some people, I understand, hunt them, hide them, hunt them, hide them, hunt them all day long.
That was a big deal with my children when they were little, and we were living in Africa, and we always lived places pretty remote. So especially if we had visitors at Easter time, we had a very special chocolate-covered candy that we would make and shape as eggs and wrap it in tinfoil. And my children would just hide them and find them and hide them and find them over and over and over again. And usually weeks later, we would still come across one someplace that maybe the ants had found, but maybe it was wrapped tight enough and the ants hadn't found it.
Well, that's better than finding real egg months later, which for you. What are some of the fun things your kids remember about Africa? We've just got a couple of minutes, but.
They loved growing up in Africa. I'm so glad, because sometimes you hear about children who, through no fault of their own, were brought up overseas and didn't find it a good experience. But both of my children really thought it was a great way to grow up.
And Darcy's very proud of being born in Africa, isn't he?
Yes. Uh-huh.
Well, after watching Out of Africa, I really am a little envious.
Well,
it was such a lovely.
We even knew a family that lived in that house. It's in that movie, Out of Africa.
But it wasn't your house.
It was not our house, but that was rather a typical British-style colonial house over there. So we generally lived in fairly big houses with big rooms and not lots of conveniences, but lots of space.
Oh, this is fascinating, and I am so glad you came all the way from over at the coast and over in Rogue River.
No, I'm half of the time with Mother over on the
Okay.
coast, and then part of the time
Thank you
in
so
Rogue
much
River.
for journeying to us with Journeys and Journals. We get to travel the most interesting places. I think this was the first time for Africa, though.
Well.
And we're so glad you call home. Southern Oregon and Northern California.
Oh, we do too. We're just thrilled. And this is finished.
We're just saying goodbye and thanks for tuning in. I'm Bernie Martin Beck saying, see you next week.